Sorry for the late video, guys. I had to go out and fight this guy called the Emperor of Man. He controlled like the entire galaxy, and I had to just destroy all of his forces, smash his entire empire, the entire religion that was built up to worship him. Had to take him out, had to take out Earth, named Terra, and now in the year 41,000 it's now time to go back to what I was always doing before, talking about video games. Specifically talking about like Sony and the Astro Bot thing and just everything that's going on with that because this is, I think, one of the most blatant AstroTurf shill campaigns I've seen since like Horizon Zero Dawn, maybe? Like, the thing I compared this to immediately was Knack, right? Because this has the Knack stamp all over it, right? What happened when Knack came out? Right? PS3 launch window, nothing was coming out. People were unironically trying to sell you on the PS4 by like hyping up Octodad and Knack, right? Those were like the big games of that release window. Octodad was Octo crap, right? Probably a cuck too, because the kids don't look anything like him. But like, uh, and Knack was severely hyped as a legitimate like competitor to Super Mario 3D World, right? I actually dug up like some of the old videos like in regards to this topic, but yeah, there were a lot of Snoys back then, a decade ago, hyping up this idea that Knack was like outperforming Mario and that Mario was on the way out and that Mario would be like a PS4 release before long. Didn't happen, obviously, but it was one of the most obnoxious things I've ever seen in my life, right? It really cemented just everything wrong with the PS4 generation in just one single release. All hype, all game journal enthusiasm, but no real substance. You would be very hard pressed today to find anybody who knows about Knack outside of people who may be hardcore Donkey fans, right? Like, Knack is an irrelevant IP that was in no way, shape, or form relevant, but it was shilled by the gaming media in order to try and destroy Nintendo, right? That's what this all comes down to. That's what it all amounts to. Like, that's the issue here, is that this was a release geared towards trying to diminish Nintendo's brand value. And today, nothing has changed, right? A couple of weeks back, Sony released a statement saying that, like, we don't have any classic IPs. We don't have anything that anybody cares about, which is true, right? Nobody cares about anything PlayStation has ever produced. No matter what people like try to tell you, PlayStation has never been able to develop a brand of icons like Nintendo has, right? So immediately after this guy says that, it seems like Sony went into overdrive trying to sell you on the idea, sell us on the idea that PlayStation has this treasure trove of IPs that people deeply, deeply care about. And I think that's what Astrobot is mostly trying to do here. It's not trying to be a success on its own merits. It's desperately trying to establish like the PlayStation brand as being on par with the Nintendo brand, with like all these characters that were at one point PlayStation icons. Like, oh, look, there's Solid Snake, who's in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Oh, there's Ryu and Ken, who are also in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Oh, there's Crash Bandicoot, who Sony sold to Activision because they had no use for the character because they understood that the character had no value whatsoever, right? That is the state of PlayStation, is that they've always had to gaslight their audience into thinking their brand is a lot bigger and more relevant than it actually is. It's why they fake sales numbers. It's why they try to pass off third-party games as being exclusives, and they try to like aggressively downplay Nintendo titles. Right? How many times have we seen over the past several days, YouTubers like RGT85 or Rolo2 Review or uh, any one of these random YouTubers like, oh, Astrobot is one of the best platformers I've played in the last decade. coincidentally, Knack came out a decade ago. This is a phenomenal release. Yeah, I don't talk about other platformers like Donkey Kong Country Returns, Tropical Freeze, or Kirby in the Forgotten Land, or Super Mario Bros. Wonder, but Astro Bot is just as good, if not better, than most of them. Even though we can clearly see, going back through your content, that you never once talked about Super Mario Bros. Wonder when it first came out, and yet you're gonna pretend to be a huge fan in order to shill Astrobot, or in order to push this narrative that Astrobot is just as good or better than Mario Wonder. And this situation, I think, really demonstrates something I've been saying for the past year or so, ever since the nobody is talking about it narrative started gaining steam, right? Like, the reality is, nobody who is really into video games is going online to talk about them, right? The people who are talking about games online are YouTubers and game journals who make money by stirring up controversy and being paid shills for products, right? This is why you don't see people really talking about legitimately good games that come out, like Princess Peach Showtime, Unicorn Overlord, Super Monkey Ball, Banana Rumble, Zelda coming this month, Mario and Luigi coming in November, right? Like, again, everything is just a grift among the online gaming sphere. And that's why all of them are so adamantly pro Sony, because Sony's brand is so reliant on those kinds of reviews and that kind of coverage that they can profit heavily off of it, right? Nobody actually plays Sony games, but like, every single time going into like the release of a Sony game, like, oh no, is this going to be the Nintendo killer? And that gets a ton of views from everybody who hates Nintendo. I remember in 2016 when the Ratchet and Clank remake came out, to tie in with the movie, right? Like, oh, Nintendo is doomed, Star Fox Zero is doomed, and we've never gotten a new and Clank game after that, right? Nobody really cares about the IP. Like, nobody wants to see it come back. Nobody cares about it, right? It's not relevant, and that's one of Sony's more relevant franchises, right? Like, that's the one icon, that's the one brand you might say is iconic to a certain demographic, but like, it's nowhere near as relevant as even like a C-list Nintendo franchises like Star Fox or Metroid or F-Zero, right? Ratchet and Clank isn't shit in the grand scheme of things. And that is just so evident by just looking at just how quickly people move on past these releases. Like Astrobot really strongly reminds me of Power World, right? Where it had that brief 2-week window of relevancy when people thought it was going to destroy Pokemon and how it was going to like own Nintendo and like just stick it to Game Freak, right? That was what all the hype and attention was about, right? It had nothing to do with Power World as a product. Nobody cares about Power World as an actual game. It was just a method to attack Nintendo, right? It was a weapon to use to downplay the Pokemon IP. And we're now seeing that Astrobot is being used the same way against Nintendo's lineup of platformers, right? Because let's be honest here, guys. Like, Astrobot isn't just competing with mainline Mario games. It's competing with Donkey Kong, Yoshi, Wario. Princess Peach has her own game now. Like, Astrobot's getting outdone by Princess fucking Peach. Like, how embarrassing is that? Like, it's one of those things where you look at what everything that's happening. You look at the narratives being put forward, like, oh, this is really original game design, guys, when like it's just a ripoff of Mario Sunshine with like the jetpack and like the water and like the visual design. Like, it just, oh, but the game looks so good. It looks way better than Nintendo platformers. No, it doesn't. Like you can tell the people shilling for this don't have any idea what they're talking about, right? Like, these are probably the kind of people who would like try and tell you that Donkey Kong 64 had too many collectibles, right? That was a heavily downplayed game at the time, right? Just like how people tried to like say Mario Wonder wasn't relevant just because it was a 2D platformer, right? Like, nobody cares about 2D platformers anymore, and yet the game has sold like over 10 million units, and it's a huge, huge success. It's my favorite 2D Mario game ever now, right? Like again, I never get tired of playing that game. It's a blast to play. It's amazing. Again, like Sony fans can't do this, right? They can't spend all their time like making fun of every Nintendo game, calling them kitty, shitting on the concept of the platformer genre, and then turn around and praise like a knockoff of Nintendo properties simply because it has like the PlayStation label slapped onto it, right? Like this is just plain sad. Okay, like that's kind of my feeling towards Astro Bot. Like I'm not angry at people like saying this is the game of the year. Like I'm just straight up embarrassed, right? Because we all know how this ends, right? This is the same thing that happened with Baldur's Gate 3, with The Last of Us Part 2, with It Takes Two, with Ghost of Tsushima. Like the more people like are exposed to this game and start comparing it to like actual real Nintendo products, like more and more people are going to realize that PlayStation cannot compete with what Nintendo is doing, right? How many times have you seen on Twitter like people point out that buzzword like, "Oh, this is how games should be made." It has no agenda. It was made by 60 people who love games, right? It's colorful, it's bright, it's a video game. You mean it's what Nintendo does? Again, like I don't understand how you could worship Astrobot to this extent and not acknowledge the simple fact that Nintendo produces games better than this all the time. It's just a cope is when you it is how I would describe this. There's a reason I don't really talk about Snoys that much in this day and age because they really are a declining demographic, right? It really does feel like people have to be paid in order to hype up Sony like they used to back in the 90s or 2000s or whatever. It's been a long downward spiral for a long time, but like people need to stop getting excited over receiving scraps from the table, right? They need to stop acting as if Sony is like blessing them with something fantastic when really you should be getting releases like this every week, like I do every time the Nintendo Switch eShop updates, right? Like again, how is it that the PS5 has been out this long and it's only now getting a relevant exclusive, well, relevant exclusive, quote unquote. But like again, people are trying to say this game is worth owning a PS5 for. It's not. Anybody who's buying this for a PS5 for this, you're gonna be disappointed. I think. Like again, there are just so many more. There are just so many better Nintendo platformers out there. I don't know why you would ever bother with this mediocre PlayStation one.